Hi, I'm Elliot Wright, and in this video I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about sound set files, approximately how they work, and a little bit about how to make them if you're interested. Now for this video I'll assume that you're already really familiar with making a manual sound set and how manual sound sets and playback configurations work. Now if you're not really familiar with that kind of stuff, that's okay. I do have a video on my channel, I'll put a link to it in the description, about how Sound IDs in Sibelius work and how you can use Sibelius to create a manual sound set in order to make the most out of your third-party VSTs. Now, once you're familiar with that kind of stuff and you've done a little bit of your own work creating your own manual sound sets and you're familiar with it, an option that you might want to look into is a sound set file. Now, sound set files can seem a little bit scary at first because there is a little bit of code involved if you want to really dive into it deep, and it's also it can sometimes feel a little less open and accessible than a manual sound set. So, if you're familiar with a manual sound set like the one that I've got up here, you may be familiar with the general practice of logging which sound IDs you want to be sent to which channels, and then hitting show on your plugin, then loading the patches that you want into the appropriate channels, hitting save, or using the preferred sounds tab to make sure that the right types of sound IDs are being sent to the right plugin, and then closing and hitting play. Now that method of operation is pretty straightforward. It's really easy to get your head around, and it's great because you can modify it on the fly. If you hit play and something doesn't work the way that you want it to, you can always just open up your playback devices template and just open up your plugin, change whatever it was that wasn't working with your patches, or change a few things here, or you can modify your playback dictionary to make sure that things work a little better. It's fairly easy to modify it on the go, and that's one of the things I really love about manual sound sets. Now there are some downsides to manual sound sets though. For example, if you are using a VST library that doesn't use just straightforward velocity controls to handle dynamics. Like for example, if you're using Hollywood strings or Hollywood orchestral woodwinds or any of the Hollywood series stuff from East West, or a variety of other VSTs that use say the mod wheel controls to modify the dynamics of the note. Well, unfortunately, a manual sound set doesn't really control MIDI signals for controlling dynamics. You'd have to use an actual sound set file. Now, a sound set file is a small file that has some XML code in it, which tells Sibelius how to handle a certain patch that you might load into it. Now, when you use an actual sound set file, you load in program names as opposed to sound IDs. So if I'm using this sound set here, which I wrote earlier last month, I could go down here and find this list of programs that I've programmed in, and I might tell the computer that in this channel here I want my program that handles first violins loaded into that channel. Now when Sibelius sees that, me telling it that I need it to use a certain program, it'll send any sounds that fall under this sound ID that's been assigned to that program in the sound set file. Any sound IDs that fall under that umbrella will be sent to this channel unless otherwise requested. And there's a little script inside the sound set file which tells Sibelius from there how to handle certain additional sound ID changes. So for example, there's a little script that says in the event of, say, plus staccato as a sound ID change, then follow the following instructions. And there can be any number of instructions, including playing a specific note as a key switch, or setting a certain MIDI parameter, Like for example, in Hollywood Strings, turning on the mute for your strings, or Sordino, is actually activated with a MIDI control. I think it's MIDI Controller 15, which is a binary one. It's on-off, so it's either 127 or it's like 1. So it's either on or off. So you can put in instructions for how to handle any given number of Sound ID changes. So I'll get into that in a moment. Now the advantage to this is that you can program your soundset file to tell Sibelius to make use of MIDI controllers for things like not only Sound ID changes, but also things like crescendos and diminuendos and things like that, which is something that a manual soundset can't really do. It also means that because you can load a program into one channel which can operate a really heavy key switching patch, you don't have to worry about filling up 16 channels with individualized Sound IDs and having it just sort of limited to only 16 articulations. So that's pretty cool. Now, if you're interested in making a sound set, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get the Sibelius sound set editor. I'll make a link in the description to the current page where you can download that. But for a long time, one of the things that I noticed, and some of you who are newer to this might also notice, is that the instructions are not necessarily all that straightforward, or it's not the easiest thing to get your head around at first. It can be a bit of a tight learning curve. So I'll try to walk you through the basic idea of the interface here, which I'll take a few minutes for, and then I'll take a look at what an actual sound set file looks like when you open it up with for its code. So let's just start here with the different tabs we've got. First, we have the general tab where you're going to name your sound set. That title there is what's going to turn up in the list of sound sets that you have here. So there's my sound set that I've got there. When I open that sound set up in the sound set editor, that name will be here. The type of sound set that you're using, I usually just go with MIDI. The number of channels, I always keep that at 16. Okay. The next tab you're going to get to is controllers. This is where you can define which kind of MIDI controllers might come into play when you're using your VST. So here it automatically has a few that are built in right away. There's the mod wheel, there's volume, MIDI volume, there's the sustain, which is kind of like a piano pedal, and there's reverb. You can always add new parameters by hitting new, like for example port legato time, like portamento legato time, which could be a numeric setting. You can add in stuff like a MIDI signal for turning on or off repetitions or legato or anything like that. I'm mainly referring in this case to the controls that you'd be familiar with play, east-west play. You can add a new controller, name it. Let's say I'm talking about the Hollywood Strings mute script. Okay, it's a numeric thing. Okay, it's the controller number, I believe, is 15, and in this case you can tell the sound set editor whether or not this is a binary setting or if it's just a normal numeric setting. So if it's binary, you can set what on means and what off means. So if you're turning it on, it's 127. If it's off, it's 0. And you can tell the sound set by default whether this should be turned on or off. In this case, if it's the mute, I should have it turned off by default. If I don't want it to be an on-off switch, I can just deselect binary, and I can tell the sound set what the default setting for this particular controller should be. So maybe I'll have it at 0. Maybe if I want all of my volume settings to be at like 64, let's say I'm using a VST that where I can only use volume to control crescendo diminuendo, which by the way would really suck, but let's just say that that's the case. I might say that I want my default to be 64, which is right in the middle between 0 and 127, so that I can turn the volume up or I can turn the volume down depending on whether I'm doing a crescendo or diminuendo. Maybe though I don't want my volume to be messed with at all. Maybe I just want all of my MIDI volumes to be at full blast the whole way, because I'm not going to use MIDI volume to control my dynamics. So I might put it at 127. Modulation, this is the mod wheel. It is MIDI controller number 1. It's by default it's turned to 0, and you may ask Sibelius to use the mod wheel to control things like dynamics, crescendo and diminuendo, for example. Alright, the next tab, volume types. Volume types and attack types, I want to specify the difference. Attack types are the controllers that you can use to affect the sound you're going to get when you hit the note. So for most libraries that you're familiar with, it's going to be note on velocity. And that's just a matter of, that's just velocity really. It's however hard you hit the key when you turn the note on. But depending on the library you're using, you might want to add, say, mod wheel, in which case you're going to want to specify that this is a controller, okay? And then it's going to ask you which of your controllers from your controllers tab do you want to employ for this attack type. And I'm going to say, well, I'm talking about the mod wheel, so I'm going to use modulation. That's the mod wheel. And you can save it like that. So that's attack types. Now I'm going to move backwards to volume types, which is very similar, but that's this kind of stuff that that can affect the volume or dynamic of the note after it's been hit. So there's note on velocity, there's mod wheel, there's MIDI volume, and these things here, again, it's a very similar kind of setup to the attack types tab. It's you name it, you determine whether it's a default control or if it's a controller. If it's a controller, then you can use one of the controllers that you defined in the previous tab there, and that just lets the sound set know that there is a volume type which uses a controller that you've defined there, or there's an attack type that uses a controller you've defined there. So you define your controllers, and then you can use those controllers either as volume types or as attack types, or both. Alright, now I know that that's a little bit of a mind bender for some folks. I'm going to head straight into the next tab though. Switch types. Switch types, this is an interesting tab. This is really kind of the heart and soul of your sound set. Now if you've got a sound set like, for example, East-West Symphonic Orchestra, like I have, this may be as simple as creating a new switch type, which is basically a set of instructions for how to operate one particular patch. You might want to name it, say, solo flute KSW, in reference to the master key switching patch for solo flute, which is found in that particular library. And under each of your patches, or each of your switch types, sorry, each of these switch types contains a set of instructions for any different sound ID change that might come its way. So you can add as many of these as you need. The first one it adds is the reset, which is basically the normal setting. So what your default articulation is going to be. So you can set here what the attack type and volume type are going to be. So what kind of controller from your volume types are you going to use for this patch, or for this, even just for this articulation, to change the volume of the note while it's playing. Now if you leave this blank, it'll go with whatever default you've set here. So if I set something that was set to default, okay, then leaving the pull down menu for volume type blank, it means that the sound set will just default to using, in this case, note on velocity as the volume type. Same thing with attack type. I can select from one of the attack types that I defined earlier here, there, or I can leave it blank and the sound set will automatically default to whichever attack type I set to default, in this case note on velocity. But let's say I want the attack type to be mod wheel. Let's say I'm working with, like, hypothetically, I know I'm all over the place when it comes to which library I'm using. Let's say I'm using Hollywood Strings, where the attack has to use a mod wheel command. Well, I might set my attack type to mod wheel. Of course, if that's a widespread thing in your library, you might want to change this to, well, sorry, you might want to just make sure that every single one of your switches has that loaded on it. Anyway, I'm going to clear that. Now, reset, as I said, that is basically the .normal sound ID for this instrument. When the reset command is sent, you're now telling the sound set to follow whatever actions are listed here. So, the first thing you're going to probably want to do is tell the computer which key switch you're going to want to activate. Okay, if it is a key switching patch you're using, this is a great time to do that. So you'll tell it, I want it to hit like D1, and that will. If I'm familiar enough with the patch that I'm describing, then what I'm telling the computer then is to default to the key switch listed under D1. So it'll hit D1 on the keyboard to activate whatever key switch is activated by D1, and that is the default patch that I want. You can also add more actions, including controller instructions. Like maybe I want to set the mod wheel to like 64 for whatever reason. Maybe, let's say I've got a sound ID change. Let's pretend for a second that I'm working with a violin patch in Hollywood Strings. Maybe I want to tell the computer how to handle a sound ID change of plus mute. Well, maybe I don't need a key switch. Maybe I just want to send a controller. Maybe I just want to send the HS mute controller and set it to 127. So that turns on the mute sound, So I hope that I'm sort of getting across the message here that this list here is all of your patches. You can create new patches or delete them down there. You can title the patch whatever way you want, just so that you are familiar with it. Okay. You can list any sound ID changes that patch might encounter. Okay. And then for each of those changes, you can select not only what kind of instructions it should use to control the volume of the note as it progresses, or to attack the note as it progresses. You can set up actions, including key switches, so it should activate a key switch or this or that key switch when you encounter this sound ID change, as well as controller changes from any of the controllers that you have outlined under your controllers tab. Okay. Now we move on to programs. This is where there's another little learning curve there, because I didn't quite understand this for a little while. Maybe that's just me, but here's how this works. You've got your switch types, which are basically, as I said, sets of instructions for how to handle certain ID changes. Okay. Now, for most programs, most VSTs, your switch types list is pretty much just going to be a list of all the patches in your library, for the most part. You could, for example, if you have a really well-organized library that only has a few different, or it has many patches, but they're all operated the same way, or there's just a few different ways to operate them, you might just have a few switch types for different types of patches, which you can use to operate, multiple patches each. I'll show you what I mean in a second. If you go over to the Programs tab, this is where you set up the list of programs that's going to show up in this drop-down list when you want to plop things into your playback or your manual sound set here. So let's say I've got my solo flute switch type, my instructions for how to handle the solo flute patch. Now I want to create a program which uses that set of instructions to play a specific instrument. It may seem redundant, but they've set this up so that it can be more flexible for different applications. I start by creating a new program, okay, and I'm going to call this, let's say, 01 solo flute. There we go. I have the option of designating this as a sound, or like an instrument, okay, or a drum map, which is outlined in the next tab. So, side note, just so everyone's aware, yeah, I feel like the attack types, switch types, programs, and drum maps, they're a little out of order. We should have drum maps before programs, but whatever. I prefer to just keep all of my channels selected there. I know that there are other applications for that. I won't get into it right now. I won't get into bank high, bank low, and program. I just leave them as is. I'm just going to show you how to use this stuff here. This is the most critical stuff. Okay, so this program that I'm creating, I'm going to name it 01 solo flute. It is a sound, so it is a typical patch rather than a drum map. Okay. The sound ID that applies to this program. So like when I load the program into my sound set, what umbrella of sound IDs are going to be sent there. So I'll write it in. Wind, and it has a little drop down menu here where you can sort of get you can kind of find your sound IDs. It's not the easiest. I might just I'll find one that's very similar, and then I'll edit it from there. Right? So there we go. That's the sound ID that I want to apply to this program. So any sound IDs under wind.flutes.flute, which is just a regular flute, right? They'll go to this program. So now, underneath this, I can designate when Sibelius is sending sound IDs to this particular program, what kind of volume type do I want to use for it? What kind of attack type do I want to use for it? And again, leave them blank if you want it to just default to the default volume or attack type. And then this is where the whole thing comes together. I can select which switch type this program will use. So in this case, this is the only switch type that I've created today. So I'll click that. And that means that when I load that program into my manual sound set, or my playback configuration, okay, Sibelius will send any sound IDs under that umbrella that I just set there into that channel, and then the sound set will tell Sibelius how to handle all of those different sound IDs based off of this switch type, or basically set of instructions for handling sound ID changes, which was defined here, and with all of these little actions here for each potential sound ID change. From there, what you want to do is you want to save your sound set, and depending on how complicated your sound set's going to be, you might not even have to get into drum maps. You might just want to define your regular instruments and just go with that. I will touch on drum maps for a moment here, just to give you a basic idea of how those work. So here we go. Here's the drum maps section. It comes already with a general MIDI kind of idea. You can take this and modify it if you like, but what I might do, for example, is let's say I've got a patch, like I'm talking about my East-West Symphonic Orchestra stuff. Maybe I've got a patch that has it's got a few snare drum sounds, it's got a few cymbal sounds or something like that, all on one patch, all being played with different notes. So I might want to, I'll start off a new drum map, and I'll name it probably after that patch. So let's call it 3 snares and cymbals. This is a hypothetical patch, but it's based off of a patch that that actually exists in East-West Symphonic Orchestra. From there, I can click Add, and I can add a new sound. Now, the name of that sound, that's something that you can do yourself. You can just name it for your own personal reference. So let's say snare drum left hit. So maybe I know that this patch has one key that activates a left hit sound, another pitch that activates a right hit sound, another one that has a loose roll, maybe a tight roll, maybe a stifle or a rim shot. You know, maybe when it comes to the cymbals, it's got a crash, maybe it's got a stifle or something like that. Okay. So then I'm going to write in what the sound ID, this applies to. So when Sibelius is going through a score, what kind of sound ID would trigger this particular sound to be played? So I'm not as familiar with all of the percussion stuff because I haven't done a lot of drum mapping. But let's say it's, you know, unpitched. It'd be unpitched drum. Let's try to find something relatively close. I'm gonna only try for like 3 seconds here. Medium snare. See, there's so many. Medium snare drum, snares on. Maybe I'll just go with this, and I'll turn this into dot left hit. Now, of course, if you're going to modify any sound IDs that you're going to create your own sort of customized sound IDs, you've got to make sure that Sibelius is going to actually send these customized sound IDs. So you need to make sure that you go into your playback dictionary and let Sibelius know that certain markings or certain note types are going to result in a specific sound ID change, and you got to write that in. But anyway, this is very much just a cursory sort of, you know, get your toe wet with this concept idea. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to tell your sound set which pitch on the keyboard is going to activate that snare drum left hit sound. So maybe it's, you know, D2, let's say. All right. Then you're going to want to add, say, your snare drum right hit, do the same kind of thing, look up the right sound ID, you know, unpitched.drum.medium.snare-drum.right hit, for example. And it automatically kind of assigns the pitch using some fuzzy logic based on your previous pitch, but maybe the pitch is something else, whatever. You assign your sound ID, you assign the key that you want Sibelius to hit on this patch in order to activate the snare drum right hit sound. Add another one for, say, drum roll, loose roll, tight roll, you know, cymbal crash. You might want to add one, for example, you know, cymbal crash, and you put in your unpitched percussion, find cymbals, or wherever it is, and then tell Sibelius which pitch on this, which note on this this patch it needs to hit in order to play that sound that you're looking for. All right, I know that I've only really just slapdashed a little bit of this together, but that's kind of the basic idea. Then you can go back to your programs, create a new program, and call it, let's say, snare and cymbal. Specify that it's a drum map. You can select which drum patch from your drum maps section you'd like which set of instructions based on what you've set up here you'd like to use. Similar to the way that you set up a set of instructions under your switch maps, and you can load that into a program. Okay, you can assign a drum map, which is also another set of instructions for operating a percussion-based patch into a new program. Okay, again, you can set your volume type, your attack type, and you can even use a switch type for some reason. I'm not really sure why you would do that, but I'm sure they've included that just for maximum flexibility. They don't know how complicated or weird your specific VST is going to be. So anyway, that's the basic idea of how to use the sound set editor. All right, next thing I want to go through. I know it's we've been going on for a long time here. I want to click on this preview tab. Okay, now you look at all this. This is all XML coding. It can look a little bit bewildering at first if you're not familiar with this stuff, but it's actually not too difficult, okay, once you've gotten familiar with it. I'm going to go over to a little program here called NotePad++, which is great for managing code if you're doing some coding stuff. This is a sound set that I made myself. It's meant to handle my East-West Symphonic Orchestra patches, and you can see here you've got, well, I've sort of closed up all of the major headings here so that it looks a lot simpler than it actually is. You've got your header info, which is the stuff that is contained under general. Okay, you got stuff like the name of the sound set, the type of sound set, all this stuff. Okay, then you've got your controller list. Okay, this covers the stuff that's under the controllers tab. Okay, each of these controllers, I'll open up, for example, the mod wheel one. That's the most familiar one. I've named it mod. The controller number is 1. It is not binary, so it's an on. It's not an on or off switch. Okay, and I've told the computer to set it as a default to 64, so right in the middle. And then I've done similar kind of things for all the other controllers. Like I've set up the expression controller, which is MIDI CC11. It's also not an on-off switch. It's a numeric thing, and I've told it to default to 64, and so on and so forth. I've done one for MIDI volume, legato on-off, repetitions on-off, portato on-off, port legato time, which is MIDI controller 5. In this case, this is specifically applicable to East-West Symphonic Orchestra. I put in a sustain pedal one just in case I might need it. The MIDI control for pan, even though I don't really use that, just in case. Balance, which is very similar to pan. Reverb, which I also don't use, but hey, I figured, hey, I'm just gonna go through the list of MIDI CCs and just throw in whatever I use. Hollywood Strings Mute. This was just in case I decide to layer my East-West Symphonic Orchestra patches over top of Hollywood Strings patches, and I want to use the Hollywood Strings Mute command, as well as the finger position command, also from Hollywood Strings, which is MIDI CC number 70, and it is also not an on-off switch. I've also sent in the all sounds off and reset all controllers, MIDI controllers. I don't really need those, but whatever. Next is your volume type list. Same kind of stuff. You've got a little bit of code for each volume type. Okay, that covers all the information that you covered under this area here. Now, you might be wondering, now that I've kind of rambled on about this for a little while, why would I, in my right mind, want to use code, all this coding stuff, to write a sound set? This seems really complicated, especially considering that the interface over here makes it pretty easy to set up things like controllers, volume types, attack types, and you're not wrong. But here's the thing: when we get to switch types, this is where it gets a little complicated. I personally think that having to, click new, click here, type, then click add, type, select things, click add, type things in, or select things here, that sort of back and forth with the mouse, the keyboard, the mouse, the keyboard, it can get really frustrating. And one thing that I don't like about this interface is it creates things in the order in which you create them. So if I want my sound IDs in a certain order, but I forget to create them in that order, well, I'm out of luck. They're going to be listed in a specific order here. Whereas if I'm working in the code here, I can copy and paste instructions from one instrument to another. So I can copy, say, my flute key switching switch type. I can copy and paste it, just change the name to, say, alto flute, and then go in and just change little things like the specific key switches, while not having to copy out or reinsert all the Sound ID changes there. So there's a lot of convenience that goes with it. When I was assembling this, I started off trying to just do one instrument at a time, one key switch or Sound ID change at a time using this interface, and it was just so tedious. I decided to just open up the thing in NotePad and just copy one switch type and paste it, and just redo the name and the key switch numbers and so on. And that's actually how I authored most of this. I just copied and pasted and then modified from there. So I've got all of my switch types there. Next is your patch list. These are all the patches that you can create under the Programs tab. That is a weird thing. It lists them as patches, but in here it lists them as programs. That can be a little confusing. Just know that the patch list, when you're dealing with the code, that is actually the Programs tab. So I've created applicable programs for all of my instruments, and each of them has a little bit of code to say which Sound ID applies to that program, what the volume type should be, what the attack type should be, and which switch type it should use. And finally, you've got your drum map list, which is Shazam. I'm not even going to show that for very long. It's a lot of copying and pasting and just drawing from whatever sources I could get. It was just tedious. Anyway, so I've then saved this, and I have then taken this file and I've placed it in the sounds folder, the appropriate sounds folder for Sibelius, so that when I open up Sibelius, it scans and looks for sound sets, so that when I create a new playback configuration, I can load up my various plugins. In this case, I'm using internal MIDI cables to route my audio out to my DAW, and I can open up the little pull-down menu here and select my sound set, or any other sound set for that matter, and tell Sibelius to use that sound set when handling that particular plugin. Alright, I know this has been a bit of a ramble rant, and I hope that I've gotten some of the basic ideas of how a sound set works, how a sound set file works, and how to operate the basics of the sound set editor. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. My next video, I'm going to be talking about what I just alluded to here, using internal MIDI cables, digital MIDI cables, to route your MIDI and your Sound IDs out of Sibelius and into your DAW. Again, I'm Elliot Wright. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.